Of all the experiences, including the experiences of the war when I was a child, the worst thing that ever happened to me was when my sister, that baby who was the hope for the future, the symbol that there was meaning and hope in life, died of cancer at the age of 31. I was 40 at the time and decided that I wanted to work with those who grieved, that I had learned so much about grief through my own life and so much about loss, that I wanted to deal with that and to share my experience. So as a middle-aged woman, I went back to school to become a psychotherapist, and I have been a psychotherapist for the past 21 years, and I specialize in working with bereavement and grief, working with people who have suffered terrible losses. And today, my children represent the hope for the future and life going on, just as my sister did in 1946 when she was born in Budapest at the close of that dark and painful period of my life. My very, very first memory was being very little, and I had either a dress or a skirt that was multicolored and it had stripes. And I remember twirling around and around and around until I got dizzy over and over again. And I remember doing that because I took such delight in seeing all the colors blend into each other and become this riot of color. I think that I've always remembered that moment because it was the one moment when I remember really feeling like a child. I don't think I had many other moments like those because my childhood was so overshadowed by what happened afterwards, by anxiety, by fear. I was born February 9th, 1937 in Krakow. I was born just before the war. My first memories, real conscious memories of my childhood, are already from behind barbed wire. When I was 4 years old, I remember sitting at the window looking out, and I could see the barbed wire and the sentry, the German soldier marching up and down with the rifle on his shoulder. And I understood that the barbed wire meant that I couldn't leave, I couldn't get out of there. It seemed natural to me. I knew nothing different. This was my life and my reality. There was only one thing that made me wonder. I had a little pin, and I remember it as almost like a campaign button, and it had a picture of Shirley Temple on it. Shirley Temple with her beautiful curls and with a beautiful smile, and that was one of my prized possessions. I remember looking at that pin and wondering whether Shirley Temple was also a little girl like me who lived behind barbed wire. But I wondered, well, maybe there is a world without barbed wire. Maybe Shirley Temple lives in a world where she can cross the barbed wire, and there are no German soldiers with rifles marching up and down. In the beginning, we were able to live in the ghetto as a family, and even though there was this atmosphere of impending doom and fear and lack of normalcy, there was really a valiant effort made to live normally. My mother came from a big Orthodox Jewish family. My mother was one of 11 grown children, and she was the third youngest, and they were all married. And of that big, huge family, of all those people and all those children, only my mother and I were left alive at the end of the war. My father came from a very different kind of family. He was an assimilated Jew. He was not religious. His parents were educated, and he was university educated. He was a dentist. And my parents were very different in their appearance, which played a tremendous role in our survival later on. If my mother lived here in this country now, she could be taken for Mexican, Italian, Puerto Rican, because she was small, olive-skinned, dark, curly hair. And in Poland, she was instantly identifiable as Jewish. My father, however, was 6'4", tall and fair, light-eyed, light-haired, and he did not look like a Jew. And neither did I. But actually, how he and I looked, our physical appearance, helped us survive the war. To jest ulica Miodowa, gdzie ja się urodziłam. This is the street on which I was born, and the name of it is Miodowa, which means honey-like. And when I was little, I always wondered why the street was named honey-like. Being here in Poland has been so moving to me in some ways. I am so moved by hearing Polish spoken. It's my native language. It makes me feel as if I am part of Poland, as if I belong here. But at the same time, I have mixed feelings, and I keep on thinking about how, if this were a different time, I could not walk on these streets. It would be dangerous for me to walk on these streets. It shocks me how there is no evidence of the past here, no evidence of what went on here, no plaques, no recognition of what happened on these streets. And that makes me feel not like a Pole, but like a Jew who happened to have been born in Poland. Around 1940, when I was 3 years old, we were forced to leave Krakow, and we were deported to a small town outside of Krakow called Bochnia, which was turned into a ghetto. I remember being in a long, long line of people, as far as the eye could see, walking with bundles, with all their earthly possessions on their backs. And it was hard for me to walk, because I was little, and so my father picked me up and put me on his shoulders. And suddenly, there were planes shooting at us with machine guns. And there was a ditch, and as many people as could jumped into the ditch. And I remember my father jumping into the ditch, and I was on top of him. My father couldn't hear well, and he couldn't see because I was covering him. And he kept on asking me, are they still shooting? Are they still shooting at us, Halina? Are they still shooting? The sound of the birds singing is so loud here that when they were shooting at us, that when my father jumped into this ditch and I heard the whistling of the bullets, I said to him, Tatusiu, ptaszki śpiewają, ptaszki śpiewają. Meaning, Daddy, the birds are singing, because I thought the sound of the bullets whistling was bird song. So I'm coming here to the Hall of Records. I am coming here to see if I can find any record of my birth, to find where I was born exactly, what address on Miodova, and also to see if there are any records of my family, my parents, any marriage records, birth records, if there's any record of that whole family that perished. At first, we were allowed to live in the ghetto as a family, even though it was behind barbed wire, and I was there with my mother and my father, and my mother's sister, the youngest sister whose name was Anja, and my mother's youngest brother whose name was Milek. Anja had been on false papers in Krakow and could have saved herself because she was fair and blue-eyed and she could pass. And you know, the story was that she was in love with a young man and he had an opportunity to escape, and he escaped and without her left her behind. And she gave up her hiding place and her false papers and came to the ghetto to join our family. And she met a man in the ghetto who was quite a bit older than she, and they actually got married in the ghetto. And I remember the wedding. I have a picture of the wedding. I have the picture of everybody in the wedding sitting around the table, and I am sitting between the bride and groom, and again, of all the people around that table, I am the only one who has survived. And I always, when I think of those moments, remember my mother's worried face, her anxiety, her tension, because she was the only one who faced reality, who, even though she went through all of these moments and did her best to help her sister celebrate, she understood and knew what was coming and listened to all the rumors and believed that Jews were being exterminated. And so she was seen as someone negative, and they called her Czarny Kruk, which means the black crow, because what we were hearing, what was being spoken about, was so unbelievable, seemed so completely outside the realm of what was humanly possible, that we were being put in cattle cars and children were being slaughtered, and that we were being gassed and burned in crematoria, that no one believed it. People couldn't believe it, but my mother did. Slowly, I began to understand. Adults tried very hard to speak in a kind of code in front of children in order not to frighten the children. And I remember as a child figuring out that when my parents spoke about someone they knew, they would mention this person's name, and they would say kropka. And kropka in Polish is the punctuation sign, period at the end of a sentence. And I don't know how I figured it out, but I understood very early on that kropka meant they were dead, they had been killed. And then I remember hearing a word in Polish many times, and it took me a long time to understand what that word meant. But that word kept on coming back more and more, and the word was Oświęcim, Oświęcim. And Oświęcim is the Polish word for Auschwitz. And we were close to Auschwitz. I think we were only about 30 kilometers from Auschwitz. And oświęcim, that very word, then became a source of dread because of the tone of voice and the expression on the faces of my parents and the other adults when they talked about it. And I understood that it was something dangerous, something threatening, oświęcim. I'm here, I was born here. I was born on Miodowa, and I would like to see if there's any record of my birth and any record of my parents.
When was it done?
I was born in 1937.
It's possible. I think there are some materials, I think, helpful for you.
Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
The names?
My name is Halina Samuel. The way this man spoke, it seems like he thought he might be able to find something. I would find it absolutely incredible. I don't have a birth certificate. I never had a birth certificate, a real one. It would be just incredible to find a record of my family. I think it would mean, I know it would mean a great deal to me to find a record and that whole family, that parish, that they existed. Up until now, for me as a child, life was normal, with the exception of the kind of dread in the air and the conversations of the adults that I was trying to understand and make sense of. I had a mother and I had a father and I had an aunt who was very comforting and loving and nurturing, and there was music, and that's all I knew. So life felt normal because I really didn't know anything else. But then it started changing. The Gestapo would come and there was a notice and we had to give things away. And so little by little, all the trappings of normal life were taken away, the china, the silver. And then we had to give up whatever furs we had. I had a little green coat. This green coat was very much part of my life for a long time during the war. And this green coat had a little fur collar, probably rabbit. And I remember my mother having to take the fur collar off the coat because we had to give up anything that was fur. And I remember her crying as she was taking it off the coat. The SS came and we gave up everything. And my mother sewed a little velvet collar where the fur collar had been and tried to comfort me and said, see, the velvet is soft. It's just as soft as the fur was. And she sewed the velvet collar on. And then we had to give up, of course, whatever jewelry we had. But of course, she hid some because she knew that our only chance of survival, our only chance of getting out was to have money or jewelry so we could bribe our way out, that it was only with money and only with diamonds and only with jewelry that we had a chance of surviving. So she hid as much as she could. Her life, my father's life, and my life were bought with that jewelry. And then the deportation started, where we sat and we waited for the knock on the door to see if our number was up, if they would come and get us. And I have this memory that has been inside me all my life, of one of those days sitting in this freezing, freezing cold house wearing my little green coat. And I was sitting and there was a white plate with a blue rim in front of me. My mother had put it in front of me and there was a piece of bread on it which she wanted me to eat. And I remember sitting there waiting for the knock on the door, and I couldn't eat that piece of bread. And that piece of bread on that white plate with the blue rim are engraved in my mind as representing that moment of waiting and waiting for that knock on the door, not knowing whether it would come or not. And it was getting darker and darker and darker. My uncle, Milek, my mother's youngest brother, he too is associated in my mind with my being a child, because he was the only one besides my Aunt Anja who nurtured me and held me and comforted me. He was so young, he must have been in his 20s. He was married, they were this young couple, and his wife got pregnant. Somehow I understood about pregnancy, but it was too dangerous, because once she started showing, then they would deport her because she was pregnant, because she could not be useful. By then the women were already working, sewing uniforms, German uniforms. And so I remember a night when my father and Milek, my young uncle, aborted the baby, and I heard her crying in pain, and I heard the muffling of the cries, because there was, of course, a curfew, and you had to be quiet. You could not bring attention to yourself. And I remember listening, somehow understanding what was going on. And after they aborted the baby, they wrapped it up, and I remember my father and my young uncle going out in the back and digging a hole to put the baby into, so there would be no sign that there had been life. I somehow, as that small child that I was, understood that this was about death, but it was also about death in order to try to preserve life. I don't remember crying as a child. I remember, on the contrary, knowing that the most important thing was silence, that making noise was dangerous, that making noise would bring the Gestapo, would bring the German dogs, would make us be discovered. And so I learned silence, and I learned to endure in silence. So I did not cry, and to this day, tears don't come that easily to me. I can be very, very moved and feel something very, very deeply, and yet the tears do not come. I think I trained myself well.
I got something.
Did you get something? Oh, that's amazing. That's my parents. Oh.
It was Sima Frisch.
I never knew the names of my grandparents.
And the marriage was made 22 March
1931. Oh. 29 ulica Starowiśna, Halina. Look, I was born officially. It's official. The deportations escalated, and then it was very systematic. The old and the sick and the children were deported to Auschwitz first, and there were no children any longer in the ghetto labor camp, because it had become a labor camp. And the men and women were separated from each other and moved into barracks that had been built. And I know that my father was already working as a welder, and my mother was put to work sewing German uniforms. This is the place, it's the first time I've been here. This is the place that was Oświęcim. And to be here knowing that my entire family perished here. My mother's 10 brothers and sisters and their husbands and wives and all their children, and my father's brother and his wife and his children, all the people who would have been aunts, uncles, cousins, the whole family. This is where they perished. And for so many years I have wanted to come to see for myself what this place that had such a huge place in my mind, in my imagination, and in my life, what it really looked like. This is where political prisoners were shot. She said whole families with children shot in the back of the head. So being here evokes all of those feelings from my childhood, all of that pain, all of that terror, that sense of anxiety that hounded me, and to a certain extent still does. One of the things I remember that made a tremendous impact, I did see the train station. I did see where the cattle cars were and where they took off from. And it was the first time there, close to it, that I actually saw a dead body. And it was not a Jewish body. I saw a gypsy by the side of the road, shot the way you would shoot an animal. And it was a young boy. And I remember him lying in this tall grass by the side of the road. And in my mind, this is closely associated with the deportations. And by then it was clear to me, even though I must have been 4 or 5 years old by then, that they were killing the children, and that that train station I had seen was dangerous, and that I could not be there. I could not allow myself to be put in one of those cattle cars. And that's what made it easier for me to do what my mother and father told me to do, especially my mother. I understood that to be separated from them, that was necessary, that I had to do it, that I had to leave them, because if I did not leave them, then I would end up in one of those cattle cars at the train station where that young gypsy boy had died, and that I would die too, even though my idea of death was young, was not so clear. I just knew that you could no longer move or walk or talk, and that it was a very, very bad thing. The house must have been close to here, because I remember the sound of the railway was always a source of fear. The railway station where they shot people, and thousands of people went through this railway station to their deaths in Auschwitz and Oświęcim. And look, there is no plaque, there's no memorial. It's like it never happened. There is no acknowledgement. There is no sign of what happened here. There was no live, visible child. Whatever child was left was hidden. So for a while, I was hidden in a Quonset hut with other children. And we all knew that we had to hide during the day. We could not go outside. We knew it was dangerous to be seen, and that we could not allow ourselves to be seen. At that point, everything that had started out at first as just rumors, as just bad news, as just the rantings of this crazy woman, my mother, who was called the Black Crow. At that point, everybody knew, everybody believed it. And at that point, I knew about being gassed and being burnt in the crematoria. I knew that what my mother had known early on, and that what so many had so much difficulty believing, that it was true and that it was happening. and the conflict between my parents, because my father said to her, "No one wants to see you, no one wants to talk to you, no one wants to be around you because you are the black crow, you are the charne crook, you say terrible things and no one wants to be around you." So there she was with this terrible knowledge and isolation, because she couldn't even get anyone to believe her, and she was blamed for her ability to face the truth, face the reality. The Quonset hut was an intermediate period between living in the labor camp and being hidden in the country with peasants. And remember, all of that was paid for. How my mother managed to hang on to some jewelry, how she managed to hide it, I don't know. It was that jewelry, those diamonds, that the SS men did not find. They found a lot of it, but the little bit they did not find is what bought my life, what paid for the peasants to keep me and to hide me. So when they say that diamonds are a girl's best friend, there's truth to it. I sometimes would go out and walk in the meadows. The way I remember Poland from when I was little, the countryside, I remember it as very, very beautiful. And I remember being very sensitive to the beauty of nature and to the solace and the comfort that gave me. And in Poland at that time, they had shrines to the Virgin Mary. And the little girls, the peasant girls, would braid garlands of flowers for the statues of Mary. And I did it too. Those were also moments which I remember in the midst of the terrible anguish of being separated from my parents. I remember those moments as being very idyllic. I remember that, I think, in my child's mind, that, the Holy Mother became my mother, and the beauty of the wildflowers and the meadow and the sunshine and the beautiful woods all around me were comfort, gave me feelings of actual happiness. I was smuggled somehow back into the ghetto because the peasants didn't want to keep me because it was too dangerous. And one very important memory for me, which somehow has allowed me to have some sort of optimism throughout my life in spite of everything that I witnessed and the slaughter that I saw, was the one time, this was in the barracks where my mother was, and they had raids looking for people or children who maybe were being hidden. And these raids were sudden and unpredictable. And there was a raid at that moment when I was there. All my mother had the time to do was shove me on the bottom bunk and to throw a blanket hanging from the very top bunk that would hide me. And I sat there waiting and waiting. And within a few moments, a young German soldier, searching, lifted the blanket, and there was that moment when he looked at me He looked into my eyes and I looked into his eyes, and it was a moment that felt like an eternity. And he looked at me and he went, shh, put down the blanket and went on. And it was because of this one young man, this one young German soldier, that I am here now being able to tell the story. And I will never know his name, and I will never know whether he survived the war or not. And I will always remember him. The last place, the fourth place where I was hidden, again with a peasant. What I remember best about that is that one day, as if by some miracle, the door to the hut was opened, and there stood my mother and my Aunt Anja. And I remember the wave of happiness, the disbelief, the joy that I felt. I don't know how they did it. And it was brief, but that's the only time that I remember that both of them held me and kissed me and hugged me. And I remember holding my Aunt Anja and holding and having a terrible time letting go of her, even a harder time than letting go of my mother. My aunt was very nurturing and very warm, and my mother was extremely tense and frightened throughout that whole first part of my childhood because she was so desperately trying to save our lives. And my aunt somehow had a certain kind of serenity, and she was the one who always comforted me. My father, who was so frightened too, would sometimes take it out on me and hit me. And it was my aunt who picked me up and brushed my hair out of my face and comforted me. When I said goodbye to my aunt, to my mother, when they walked away, and I saw their receding backs, and I saw them get smaller and smaller, I believed that I would never see my aunt again. I remember the wrenching pain of seeing her leave. And that's what happened. That was the last time I saw her. That's what I remember the best about the last hiding place. The other thing is how my time as a hidden child came to an end. This peasant, who was so brusque and said so little, came to me and said, "In 3 days, I am going to take you by the side of the road where the woods are. I'm letting your mother know that I'm going to drop you off there. I can no longer keep you. It is too dangerous. I don't know if your mother will be there or not." And what I remember, and that I do remember very clearly, was wondering for 3 days what would happen if she wasn't there. I knew she was behind barbed wire. I remembered the sentry and the guardhouse, the soldier with the gun and the other soldiers with the guns. How would she get out? And I knew he meant it. And as promised, he took out his bicycle and he made me sit in the back. And I remember sitting in back of him, and I remember him pedaling. And I remember the beautiful Polish woods, the trees, and that it was beautiful. And then he stopped, and he let me down off the bicycle, and I walked into the trees, and just past a few yards It was in a clearing just like this one that I saw my mother and my father sitting with other people, and it was like a picnic. It seemed so peaceful, and my mother grabbed me, and I remember the moment, tremendous moment of relief and of seeing her, because I had been frightened that I would be left alone here in the woods. I knew the peasant would leave me, and the real joy of seeing my mother, and she grabbed me and held me and embraced me, and then we all stood up and started walking. And thus began our journey to Hungary, the long walk. I don't know exactly how long we walked, for how many days. I think it was about 10 days or so, maybe even longer. We would walk all night under cover of darkness, and we hid during the day. That first day and night when we walked, we had no guide. And I heard the adults whispering, "We will meet the guide. There's a meeting place for the guide." And the guide was going to be provided or sent to us by this mysterious thing called the underground. And I didn't know what that was. But I knew that it had to be good because it would lead us where we wanted to go. And we were afraid as to whether he was really from the underground, or was he a German, or was he someone who was going to betray us. So there was a lot of fear. And I remember one night in particular with a full moon, that it felt we were so exposed and it was so bright, and we had to cross a big, big field. It was covered with haystacks, and the haystacks were tall, and we would walk from haystack to haystack, walking carefully around each haystack, seeking protection, hiding behind each haystack before we felt safe enough to walk on to the next one. And I remember the sound of the dogs in the distance, dogs barking. And I had heard that the Germans had dogs and they chased us with dogs. And I knew that we were running away from the Germans. And to this day, when I hear dogs barking in the distance, I feel a wave of fear. One evening as we were walking, we passed a tiny village with some huts, and a peasant woman was standing outside one of the huts. And she looked at me and she said to my mother and father, "Such a pretty child, such a pretty little girl, leave her with me. You know that if you take her with you, she will die, she will be killed. But if you leave her with me, I'll take good care of her and she will live." My parents had a screaming argument about whether to leave me or not, because my father wanted to leave me and my mother did not want to leave me. And my father was saying, "At least she'll live, at least she'll live." And my mother would not leave me. My mother said, "If she has to die, let her die with us." That was a moment of great terror, almost the greatest terror that I experienced, because it felt as if the possibility of being left was very, very real. And the great surge, the great enormous wave of relief when we started walking and they took me with them. And as we were walking, I remember the words started coming up over and over again in Polish. Zielona granica, which literally means the green frontier or the green border. I didn't know if it was a fence, but something painted green. But I could tell that the words were repeated with a lot of anxiety. And so my anxiety mounted as we approached Zielona granica, the green border. I think it was called the Green Frontier because that was actually the frontier between Poland and Hungary, and once we crossed that, we were safe because Hungary had not yet been occupied. That moment of that crossing and the memory of it has haunted me. There were Germans there, there were dogs, the dogs I was so afraid of, the dogs were barking, and somehow we had to get across to the other side of some invisible line, and I think we had to do it one by one as the light shifted. I was told to go, you're little, they won't see you, go, run fast, and not being able to do it. It was a short distance, it was only a few meters, but it seemed to me like being asked to run an impossibly long distance, something I could not possibly do. But ultimately, I ran with my mother. I wasn't able to run across by myself. And we made it. We all made it. And so we got to Budapest. I have a very clear memory, these 10 adults and myself, this little child, wandering about, not knowing where to go, with no belongings, because I think that whatever clothing, whatever anyone had been bartered for food on the way. And we sat on a park bench. And as we sat there, we saw a Jew walk by. And one of the group went up to him and asked him where we should go, what we should do, and spoke to him in Yiddish. And he told us where to go for the underground, to find the underground, because everybody knew that the occupation of Hungary would be coming soon and making preparations. What the underground was going to do for us is provide us with false papers and send us to a place that was safe. I had a vague understanding what false papers meant, but I did know that it meant that I would have to pretend to be someone different from who I was yet one more time. I had already had a different name once when I was hidden with the peasants in Poland. It was a real birth certificate for a little girl with the same first name that I have, which is a very, very common Polish name, Halina, and with a Gentile last name. I would become that little girl in that safe place where we would be sent. At this point, I was 6 years old, and I don't know how we got to Kadarkut. But I remember Kadarkut very well. It was a village, and it had the Hungarian population there, and a settlement of Poles who were Catholics. And because they had no medical man, they had no doctor, we were supposedly sent there because my father, being a dentist, was the official medicine man for the Polish settlement. I know that we lived with a peasant woman, and we lived in a peasant house, a peasant hut, and she was very, very kind. She welcomed us. Just after we got to Karakut, my mother found out that the ghetto had been liquidated 3 days after my parents escaped, 3 days after, which meant had they not been forced to escape when they had to in order to save me, they would have lost their lives too. They would have been deported to Auschwitz along with my mother's sister Anja, my aunt Anja, and Uncle Milek, her youngest brother. And when she found out, she broke down and went into a suicidal depression. She did not want to live and tried to kill herself over and over again, each time in front of me. Once she took an overdose of aspirin. She took a whole enormous bottle of aspirin and was unconscious for a while. And another time she tried to throw herself under the wheels of the horse-drawn carriage of the Hungarian militia. Another time I was sleeping and I was dreaming that an acrobat was walking on a wire with a glass of water, and he slipped and fell, and the water spilled, and as he was falling, he was screaming, and his screaming in my dream woke me up. What I woke up to was my mother screaming, my mother making strange noises as she was trying to hang herself. She had the rope and had knocked over the chair and was struggling and making strange, terrible noises. For many years, I carried within myself the sense that I had to be so perfect and so good to earn the right to be alive, because Anja and Milek had died so I could live. And for the rest of her life, my mother felt that she had sacrificed them for my sake. I owed my life to the death of these two people that she had loved so much. And for many years of my childhood, I had a fantasy well into young adulthood that maybe by some miracle, maybe she had survived, and maybe someday there would be a reunion, and maybe I would get to see her again, that maybe she had survived. The reality is that she died at Auschwitz. Part of being good was playing my role as a good Catholic girl, because it was up to me to convince the people in the Polish colony that we were indeed Catholic. And I played my role to the hilt. I played it so well that I really ended up not knowing what was real and what wasn't, who I really was I Catholic or was I not? I went to church every single day, to this very church, and the church was a magical place for me. I learned the catechism, I had my first communion, I learned all the prayers, and then I taught the prayers to my parents, and then I taught the prayers in secret at night to the other families that were pretending to not be Jewish. And I didn't look Jewish. I looked like my father. I was fair-skinned, light-eyed, straight, light hair. I had a Slavic look to me, and that's what saved our lives. And I believe that my father told me that of all the 3 or 4 families hiding in Kadarkut, we were the only ones who were not deported. We were the only family that survived. I think what I wanted more than anything was to feel part of something. I knew that I was a stranger. I think that's part of the reason I connected to the church as deeply, as profoundly as I did, because I felt I belonged there. I wanted to feel that I belonged to something, and the ritual of the church felt welcoming and magical. One Easter, they put on a passion play in the church, and that too remains in my memory as a profound moment that impacted me tremendously. As Christ was walking across the stage, bearing the cross, in pain, burdened, I think that even then I connected it to all the pain and all the suffering that I had experienced and seen. I became the caretaker of my parents, the caretaker of my sick mother, the caretaker of my father, who was so scared and so tense and so nervous. It was impossible to have the playfulness and the carefree feeling of childhood while being made to be responsible for the survival of the family, because when we were in Kadarkut, I knew my family's survival depended on how well I played my role as a good little Catholic girl. And I knew that if I didn't do that well, that I would be responsible for my parents' death. There was a moment when I almost told, a moment when it was a near miss. It always has seemed to me similar to that moment in the barracks when the German soldier lifted the blanket, saw me, and went shh, and in that split second saved my life. There was one late afternoon at dusk, playing with other children, another little girl who had told me something, a secret, and I felt lonely and sad, and I wanted to have a friend. And as children do, as a gift, I wanted to give her a gift of this strange thing about me, that I was really Jewish, whatever that meant. And I almost told. And to this day, when I remember that moment, it frightens me, because that would have meant death. I almost told. Kadarkut, where we were hiding under false papers, it turned out was on the Russian-German front, very, very close, just a few kilometers away. And the Russians would come at night after the fighting, and they would sleep in the hut, like 30 people maybe, women and men together, sleeping on the mud floor, resting after the fighting, and in the morning taking off and going back to the actual front. I liked the Russians. They were mostly young. I remember one soldier in particular. He was very young, and I think he was redheaded, and he used to put me on his lap and play with me, and he had a little toy gun, and told me that the Germans had killed his entire family, his mother and his father, his brothers and his sisters. And he said to me, "And tomorrow morning when I go, remember," and then he showed me with the toy gun, "I will kill one for my mother and one for my father and one for my brother." And I used to wait for him to come back at night. And he came back 2 or 3 times, and one night he did not come back. And I remember standing and waiting for him and understanding that he had not come back because he had been killed. If my parents were still alive, they would have said that I was crazy, zwariowana in Polish, to have come back here, this place that was a place of such pain and terror for them. So I came here to Kadarkut with an image in my mind of Kadarkut the way it was when I was here. A little village with some huts here and there with thatched roofs, with chickens and roosters and pigs roaming around, with dirt roads. And what I found was a little town with cars and trucks and houses and no horses and no horse-drawn carriages. And the world that I remember, the Kadarkut, I remember the Kadarkut that exists in my mind and that has existed in my mind for all these years, has vanished. It's a vanished world. It's a world that is gone forever. We were in Budapest when the war officially ended. I was 8 or 9 years old, and there was celebration and a joyfulness. But I don't think that my parents and the other survivors celebrated. I don't think they were capable of celebration. This was at a time when the survivors from the concentration camps and the ghettos and the ones who had been in hiding like we were came together in Budapest, and people started connecting with each other. And that is when I remember being almost plunged into an atmosphere of constant, ongoing grieving, because these were all people, all the survivors who had lost not only everything they had ever owned, but many of them had lost husbands, wives, their entire families, fathers and mothers and brothers and sisters, and many had lost children. And this is the time when people started talking to each other, and it all came together, all the things that had been rumored and heard about and known but not validated became concrete and real. They were shot in August 43, which is when they were liquidating all the ghettos, the Bochnia ghetto and the little ghetto where they were, and she was shot with her 2 children. We escaped 3 days before the liquidation of the Bochnia ghetto, and that must have been right then, because that's when she was shot with her children. There were photographs that had been taken in the concentration camps and smuggled out. And it was the first time that I had seen the reality of the concentration camps. And I remember feeling absolutely horrified, because everything that I had heard about and which I had tried to imagine in my own mind became real. And then slowly and gradually, it seemed as if hope was returning. And the most obvious sign of that was that most of the survivors who were of childbearing age were pregnant. And all these women who had experienced and seen and feared death for years were bringing forth life. And all those pregnancies seemed to me to represent that there was hope, there was a future, we would be okay. And my mother was also pregnant, and very obviously so at some point, and she was terribly afraid that her friends would realize that I knew what that meant, because you weren't supposed to tell children the facts of life. And a lasting memory my entire life has been walking into the hospital and seeing my mother in the bed, and then running over to see the baby in the little crib, and seeing my sister for the first time, seeing what seemed to me to be the most beautiful baby that had ever been born, and touching her. She had a lot of very dark hair, and I touched her hair for the first time. And to this day, I can remember the feel of that soft hair on my fingers. And I loved her from that moment, and that moment has always stood in my memory as the moment when the war truly ended and life, a different life and a new kind of life, had really begun. I am Halina Irving. I was born in Krakow, Poland on February 9th, 1937. When I was 2 years old, World War II broke out.